In an age in which the Western world continues its decline in allegiance to the Christian tradition, the quest persists for a worldview that attributes meaning to the life and death of the individual. In the following lecture, Howard F. Dossor suggests that the most satisfactory aspects of that search may be an intellectual shift of focus from the individual to the very foundation of our experience, and an examination of our place, not simply in society and history, but also in the expanding cosmos. Howard Dossor is a Melbourne writer and presenter who has lectured regularly to the Existentialist Society in that city and whose various publications are available through Amazon.com. We invite you to join him now as he discusses life on the ledge.
Good evening, and thank you for being with me. In Fyodor Dostoevsky's polemical novel Notes for Underground, the unnamed narrator, who serves to present the author's underlying theme, laments that, and I quote, "We're so unused to living, we often feel something like loathing for real life, and we're all agreed, it's better in books. After all, we don't even know what real life is lived nowadays, or what it is. We don't know whose side to be on, what to love, what to hate, what to despise, or what to reject. We even find it difficult to be real human beings with flesh and blood of our own." End of quote. The narrator's lamentation provides the foundation for the novelist's plea. Dostoevsky longs for an authentic alignment between our individual existence and the essential quality of life. But what is the quality of life? What indeed is life? This is a question that humanity has addressed across the centuries, and to which various unaccountable answers have been proposed, from the mythological to the theological, to the philosophical, and even to the scientific. And yet, the fact that we persist in asking the question indicates that we have not arrived yet at a satisfactory answer. Because the individual who asks the question has himself or herself a lifespan, a direct experience of life, the tendency has become for us to define life in terms of our individual existence. We do, of course, sense that there is a life beyond ourselves, outside ourselves, but by and large, we concern ourselves with the life within. And if we do extend our thinking to embrace the wider life, we restrict it to a very narrow range. The question, what is life, then, should perhaps more properly take a different form. Perhaps we should limit the use of the word life to refer to animal and plant life on Earth, or, if it exists, its equivalent outside the planet, and address instead the question, what is life in itself? Before it becomes feasible to address this question in any significant manner, there emerges a prior question to which we must pay attention. We must ask ourselves, what is definition? Definition is the business of dictionaries, but if we turn to the shorter Oxford English Dictionary on Historical Principles, we find that it is the word life that is defined rather than life in itself. And, indeed, we also find that the meaning of the word changes depending upon the context in which it is used. Hence, life is, I quote, primarily the condition, quality, or fact of being a living person or animal, end quote. Or life is, quote, the period from birth to death, end quote. Again, according to Oxford, life is, quote, the term of duration of an inanimate thing, or vitality as embodied in an individual person or thing, end quote. Let us suppose that someone asks me to tell them what a pen is. Because I wish to offer as precise an answer as possible, I place my pen on the tabletop and examine it closely. In so doing, I place myself outside the pen and observe it in its entirety. I see its shape, its colour, and its plastic or metal casing. I place in my mind a picture of other aspects of the pen. I see its interior and the toner or fluid it contains. I see the flow it is capable of producing when pressure is applied to its tip. I also see something of its function. I comprehend that it is an instrument for writing. I build the meaning of the pen into my definition. In defining it, I take all these factors into account and offer my answer to my inquisitor. Although I am in fact defining a word, yet I managed to give some indication of the essence of the pen. But life itself cannot be treated like a pen simply because I cannot get outside it to observe it in its fullness. I myself am within life in itself, a living part of it, and the part cannot comprehend the whole. Thus, I cannot know the whole of it because it is paradoxically both subjective and objective. Life in itself, then, is beyond my comprehension. And yet, I experience it. It pulsates within me, and in consequence of that experience and pulsation, I can make descriptive statements about it. Statements made about life can arise only out of experience, observation, and reflection of an individual. They can, of course, be shared among individuals, and to the extent that this is accomplished, they may begin to cohere to the point where they begin to influence human behaviour. Disparate understandings of the deep identity of life in itself will produce disjunctive behaviour. Clearly, a person responding to life in itself as a whole rather than to his or her individual experience of it will very likely feel themselves as a more complete person and will add to their capacity to contribute to the enhancement of society. Under the demands of objectivity, statements made about life in itself can only be based on what we observe of life in action. But because we ourselves can be subjective, it is legitimate to interpret what we see and to understand life in itself in terms of our interpretation. Thus, the rigours of science can be brought to bear, but the less restrained observations and interpretations of the artist also have a role to play. The poet and the musician have access to dimensions of life in itself that cannot be examined under the microscope. Life in itself, then, may be said in the first place to be social. That is to say that life in itself is not a singular unit, but a community. It is composed of countless features. The American microbiologist and biophysicist Carl Weiss has proposed that, quote, the first life was not an organism at all, but rather a community of organisms that freely swapped information in a collective genetic pool, end quote. Bill Messler and H. J. Cleves II point out in their A Brief History of Creation that, quote, throughout most of history, humans were unaware of the ubiquitous life forms with which we share the earth. We wandered about, blind to the teeming jungle of tiny life forms that we mistook for a barren desert. The microscopic creatures that Anthony van Leeuwenhoek observed in his drop of water from Berkelsey Mere were the first glimmers indicating that the world was much more densely populated by life than human beings had ever imagined. As the evolution of humanity has proceeded, the quintessentially social quality of life in itself has, of course, been manifested more in the communal domain than in the individual. Increasingly, according to the German novelist Hermann Hesse, individualism that has disconnected itself from the totality of things is coming to be regarded as an aberration. Nothing in life in itself exists by itself and in isolation. Significantly, even Christians who propose a symbolic Godhead as being responsible for creation found it necessary to identify a Trinity, a community within that Godhead. All parts of life within life in itself are distinct and yet inseparable. Hermann Hesse again has reminded us that, quote, everything has a life of its own and is more than the mere aspect of utility under which we consistently consider it, end quote. Nonetheless, because it is social, life in itself is and acts in accordance with being an interaction between parts. Nor is it an interaction between some parts, but between all. Life in itself is relational. The connective principle that is life in itself is reciprocal. It is not a matter of one feature acting upon another, but of each acting upon each other. It is this reflexivity that acts to establish and maintain the unity of life in itself, and which makes it desirable for human beings to think in ever-broadening categories. Specialization in science has its place, but the drawing of barriers between specializations is to be carefully monitored. In current terminology, life in itself is holistic. Life in itself, we may confidently assert, is motion. Living things move. This is observably the case regardless of the size of the thing. According to the best insights of contemporary physics, the entire universe is moving outward at an exponential rate. And if this is true, it follows that everything within the universe is moving with it. Nor is movement simply an external phenomenon. Every object contains movement within itself. As Messler and Cleves point out quote, "The rock, that is, every rock, is made up of chemical elements, some of which are present as a mixture of isotopes, atoms of the same element, that have different members or numbers of neutrons in their nuclei. Some isotopes are unstable and radioactive, and they are constantly, albeit slowly, decomposing into new, lighter elements." End quote. Death, which we suppose to be the cessation of life, is thought of as an immobility. The corpse lies still. But while death does occur at an individual level, yet it takes place within the broader concept of life in itself. What an individual life was during its historic existence was composed of more than a body. It embraced thought. It generated feelings. It inspired hopes. And these things do not terminate with the individual's death. Every living man bears within himself the history of his species and the species out of which that species arose, etc. We bear within ourselves the history of life in itself. The life in itself that was the life of a deceased person is never lost. It moves into another shape and moves onward. If this were not so, man could not have come into being. Life in itself encompasses death. Because life in itself is movement, it follows that it can have no beginning or end. Life in itself is movement in perpetuity. In his publication, What is Life?, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Erwin Schrödinger expressed the view that the basic element inherent in all life is the ability to avoid the inevitable fate, the decay into entropic chaos. Its nature as society, together with its relationality, means that life in itself is change. Paradoxically, the very stability of life in itself resides in its adaptability and constant reshaping, reforming, and ongoing development. Just as the child longs to become an adult, so life in itself continuously strives to become more than it is. Although it tolerates negative change, it moves to correct it and seeks pathways of enhancement. It may not be unreasonable to suggest that change, which characterises life in itself, is in fact growth. The paradoxical resolution of the dichotomy between stability and flexibility points to the fact that life in itself is synthesis. As synthesis, it is the merging of Buber's I and thou into a unity that negates neither person. It is the fusion of the external with the internal. It is the matrix in which yesterday and tomorrow coalesce into today. It is the reconciliation of question with answer. It is the melding of the organic and the inorganic. It is the interlocking of the material and the immaterial. It is the linkage between the potential and the realized. It is the union of the lucid with the mysterious. It is the interplay of the real and the ideal. It is the nexus between necessity and freedom. Life in itself, as Oxford allows, is self-perpetuating energy. It is the engine of vitality, of power. It drives itself and all of its own parts. As energy, it is visible in a myriad forms, ranging from the blink of an eye to the movement of the cosmos ever outward. Albert Einstein and others have shown, as intimated in a note attached to the energy entry in the Shorter Oxford Dictionary, that matter itself can also be regarded as a form of energy. As energy, life in itself is a regressive cause. That is to say, that all cause, even the cause of cause, is caused by energy. If there was in fact a Big Bang, as decreed by science, it was the effect rather than the cause of energy. And if science remains unable to take hold of what is called dark energy in space, it may be because dark energy is life in itself. Life in itself is freedom. Perhaps this can be made apparent through a metaphor. Imagine a field of chaos in which total disorder prevails. Now, introduce into the field an indefinable force that has the ability to move, increasing its own identity with every motion and establishing more and more order wherever it touches. Although no metaphor is without its limitations, this image points to life in itself as freedom, and to be a part of life in itself is perforce to be free. To the extent that we resist life in itself, we imprison ourselves. Freedom is but another name for control over chaos. Life in itself is reality. Nothing can be real except that it is embraced within life in itself. Travel where we will, touch what we will, think what we will, imagine what we will, yet we remain within life in itself. The very gods we create must themselves be located within life in itself. To be fully aware that we ourselves are within life in itself is to be in touch with reality. It is to know the truth. To know the truth is to recognize the foundation for morality. The real, the true, and the moral arise out of the essence of life in itself. For many, such a contention will appear to be not only excessive, but incapable of validation. In terms of the assertion that life in itself is truth, we might do well to reflect on the assertion of Vladimir Lenin that, quote, truth is formed out of the totality of all aspects of a phenomenon of reality and their mutual relationship, end quote. The test of truth is the rest of truth. With regard to the contention that life itself is morality, we might do well to listen to the position of the Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. MacIntyre argues that the question, quote, what am I to do with my existence, cannot be answered before we answer a prior question, namely, of what story or stories do I find myself a part? It is to life in itself that we must turn if we are to comprehend the authentic and ethical foundation for our behaviour. But our critics may respond by suggesting that we need only to look to nature to find a sufficient model for our living. To thine own self be true, they will advise us, echoing Shakespeare's Polonius. If one examines again the shorter Oxford Dictionary for its definition of the word nature, we find, quote, the creative and regulative physical power which is conceived of as operating in the physical world and as the immediate cause of all its phenomena, end quote. While we might wonder whether power can be physical, where can it be seen, touched, heard, smelled or tasted? We can well believe that there is a power that performs the functions identified in the definition. Would it be improper to call that power life in itself? Is there a more creative or regulative power operating in the physical world and causing all its phenomena than life in itself? Nature is nothing less than life in itself in operation, life in itself functioning. We observe it in every moment of our existence. For Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, it is a smorgasbord of quite wondrous acts of transformation, an ever-changing kaleidoscope of splendour and colour. For many of us, it lacks vitality. In general, we comply with the external requirements it imposes upon us, but often lament what we think of as a shallowness in our inner lives, because we close ourselves off from life in itself. Demeaning ourselves in the getting and spending of material possessions, we fail to grasp the opportunity to assimilate the quality life in itself has to offer us. Life in itself is spiritual. In a post-religious age, we may blanch at the word, but let it stand here simply to represent the non-material. If we are to be in accord with our essential nature, with life in itself as it activates us, our focus must be on spiritual values. Nor need we spell out those values. We know them. Life in itself imprints them on our consciousness. In denying them, we restrict our capacity to experience life in itself. In embracing them and in expressing them through our behaviour, we enrich ourselves and enhance life in itself. It should not surprise us then that Hermann Hesse should have prophesied that, quote, rediscovering the art of living spiritually and of holding spiritual property in common will become an existential question for European civilization, end quote. Notwithstanding all that we might contend about the essence of life in itself, the fact is that it remains a profound mystery. As the perceptive Hermann Hesse tells us, quote, spelled backwards, the German word for fog, Nebel, reads Leben, meaning life. An uncertain, wandering state is conveyed in the Nebelleben, this life in the fog, which remains shrouded in mystery despite our need for enlightenment. The darkness does not cease when we try to illuminate it. It simply moves further away, end quote. Nor should we wish it otherwise, for mystery is the domain into which life in itself progresses. In its absence, there are no more questions, and without questions, there are no more answers. Every answer must ultimately be reshaped as a question. Life in itself is the endless unveiling of an ever-transcendent horizon. In his study of the idea of the holy, the German philosopher Rudolf Otto speaks of mysterium tremendum e fascinans. For mysterium, read holy other, or something experienced with untrammeled wonder. For tremendum, read a sense of objective presence, energy, vitality. And for fascinans, read fascinating. While Otto uses the phrase to speak of the holy, we might well utilise it to refer to life in itself as being a tremendous and fascinating mystery. Although we should resist any temptation to attach a narrowly religious connotation to it. The Cretan philosopher and novelist Nikos Kazantzakis, best known for his novel Zorba the Greek, reminds us that life in itself is ascent, but it is ascent not in the sense of climbing a mountain until the summit is reached. His notion is rather of an ascending eagle, circling round and round, increasing with each round the circumference and height of its reach. Nor can we imagine a limit to its climb. The ascent is endless as more and more matter is transmuted into spirit. Kazantzakis himself expressed his sense of it in a beautiful passage. The ascent is, quote, an onslaught, a spirit rushing, storming through matter and fructifying it. As it passes beyond the animal, it creates man, digs its claws into his head like a vulture and shrieks, "It is our turn now." It moulds us, pummels matter into us, and turns it into spirit, tramples on our brains, mounts astride our sperm, kicks our bodies behind it, and struggles to escape. It is as though the whole of life were a visible, eternal pursuit of an invisible bridegroom who, from body to body, hunts down his untamed bride, eternity. End quote. Life in itself is the ultimate value. Nothing of which we can conceive can exceed it in value, because nothing we can conceive can have reality outside it. We opened this reflection with a quotation from the writings of Fyodor Dostoevsky. In drawing to a close, we might note a passage from the same writer's novel, Crime and Punishment. Quote, "I've read somewhere that someone condemned to death says or thinks an hour before his death that if he had to live on some high ledge, so narrow that he could only stand, with the ocean below him and in everlasting darkness and solitude, yet he would decide that it were better to live under those circumstances than to die at once. Only to live and live, whatever it may be." End quote. This is the fundamental human cry. It is not simply a cry for a longer life. Fundamentally, it is a cry for a higher quality of life. It is a longing for a deeper engagement with life in itself, for we have in the core of our being an intuitive understanding that life in itself is the summum bonum of human existence. Any anxiety associated with a sense of our being confined to a narrow ledge, to a life characterised by discomfort and devoid of meaning, is assuaged by an openness. As we allow life in itself to penetrate more deeply into our sense of self, the ledge broadens and extends. Our sense of security is strengthened as we come to realise that nothing less than life in itself is the very ground of our being and the horizon that beckons us forward. Thank you and good night.